This episode is part 2 of our 2-part feature on James Augustus Hicky, the man who started the first newspaper in India. If you're just joining us on this podcast, we recommend that you press pause here and go back and listen to part 1. We'll still be here when you're done listening to the previous episode.
It was a sweltering day on the 26th of June 1781 when James Augustus Hicky's trial began. He had only been publishing his Bengal Gazette for a year and a half, and already he was in the dock for libel. A day earlier, the Gazette had carried a special edition in which Hicky wrote about his impending trial. He saw his trial as an attack on the liberty of the press and on free speech. In Hicky's mind, he was not on trial. Freedom of speech was on trial. And if this was gone, he wrote, "We shall be in the condition of the sheep. When our dogs, our guardians, are gone, our house may be robbed whilst we sleep." He called the charges of libel against him malicious defamation. Hicky then went on to show how the grand jury was stacked against him. Everyone on the jury, even the Supreme Court Chief Justice Elijah Impey, had some connection to Governor-General Warren Hastings or the East India Company. You see, in May 1781, Hicky had published a poetic exposé which mockingly showed that Chief Justice Elijah Impey was corrupt and in the pocket of Warren Hastings. Why did he do so? Well, in the district of Burdwan, river embankments were in severe need of repair. The contract to repair these embankments, called Poolbandi, was given to a man, Archibald Fraser. While past contractors for Poolbandi were paid about 25,000 rupees annually, Fraser was going to be paid 90,000 rupees, almost 4 times what the job was worth. But here is what rang the alarm bells for Hicky. He learned that Fraser was Impey's cousin and was also the Supreme Court sealer and examiner. Plus, he lived in Impey's house. If this was not enough, a month before Hicky published his exposé, a correspondent had told him that Impey was taking a cut of the money given for Poolbandi through indirect means from his cousin Fraser. Hicky saw this as corruption, plain and simple, and he knew then that the Supreme Court did not represent a fair legal system. So he began referring to Elijah Impey as Lord Poolbandi in the pages of the Bengal Gazette. When Hicky stood in court as his trial began in June 1781, he knew that this was an uphill battle, almost impossible to win. He knew that he did not stand a chance of walking out of there a free man. After all, the sitting judge on his trial was the very same man whom he had mockingly referred to as Lord Poolbandi, Chief Justice Elijah Impey. What happened at the trial? Could James Augustus Hicky put his faith in a judicial system that he knew was compromised and corrupt? This is Reality Scribes. I am Sumit Chaturvedi.
And I'm Vasundhara Sirnate. We are Indian journalists who are, in this podcast, telling you the story of the origins of Indian journalism. We are taking you through the history of Indian society's news and information ecosystems, our news culture, and how these have evolved over years, decades, and centuries. On his first day in court, nothing went as Hicky wanted. His lawyer, Anthony Fay, tried to show that the unfavorable phrase, Clive's miserable successor, that Hicky had published in the Gazette did not refer to Warren Hastings. For Hicky, the matter was not about the details of what he had printed. The case was about the freedom of the press. Annoyed at the proceedings, Hicky jumped up in court, turned to Elijah Impey and said, "The best security of the press is an honest and disinterested jury." He went on to defend himself by saying that he hadn't written the words. He had merely printed a letter written by someone else. Here's some context that we need to understand what was going on at Hicky's trial. You see, back in the 1700s, libel in England was decided by the judges of a court, not juries. The juries had two jobs: to determine who had printed an article and whether the article in fact referred to the person who was being libeled. Once this was decided by a jury, the judge determined whether the printed article carried any malicious intent to libel a specific person. What happened at Hicky's trial was historic. As he interrupted his lawyer, he tried to convince the jury that they were the ones who could determine malice and libel, not the judges. He also said that what he had printed were letters written to him by other people, so he personally could not be held for libel, as technically he hadn't written those specific words. But Hicky had missed something. The trial was not really about what he had printed. It was about his general disregard for the bigwigs of the East India Company and his criticism of how the company conducted its business in India. For over a year, he had printed enough mocking commentary by himself to irk people in the company. At that time, honor and reputation meant a lot to individuals. Hicky's Gazette was also being reprinted in England, and people feared that his words would harm their reputations back home and perhaps even cost them seats in the British Parliament. People in the East India Company also had another worry. Often they felt that the details that Hicky printed had to come from someone higher up the ladder. Some even widely believed that the attacks on Hastings printed in Hicky's Bengal Gazette were motivated by Philip Francis, who was back in England, but very, very eager to tear Hastings down. Back in the courtroom, the jury listened dispassionately as Hicky asked them to determine libel, not the Chief Justice. As proceedings on day one came to an end, the jury retired to deliberate through the evening and the night. The next morning, the courtroom was packed again. Hicky tensed as members of the jury stared at him. Finally, the verdict was read out. Not guilty. Hicky looked up as the courtroom erupted in cheers. Some of the color returned to his face. He had won round one. He was not as lucky in round two. After a harrowing legal battle, Hicky was finally found guilty of printing the phrases "all despotic" and "great Mughal" to refer to Warren Hastings. He had lost round two. Slowly, the court proceedings turned to the libeling of the missionary Johann Zacharias Kiernander. Hicky did not fare well in this round either. We asked Dr. Andrew Otis, Hicky's biographer, who you've already met in the last episode, to walk us through Hicky's court battle.
So what happens is Hicky accuses this missionary, Kiernander, of embezzling funds from his own mission to give out. And Hicky, at the same time, I think the more substantial of the cases was actually against Warren Hastings, and that Hicky accuses Hastings of abuse of power, corruption, calling Hastings the great Mughal, the despotic ruler, and all these things that really irk Warren Hastings, and eventually they become too much. And I think there's a couple of particular articles where Hicky says that if we're not getting any representation, then why should we remain loyal to the East India Company? And those articles that really call into question the general loyalty of, say, the European population in Calcutta and Bengal, I think they really make the East India Company and the leadership of the East India Company think twice about should we allow this to be printed. And so Warren Hastings institutes 3 different libel prosecutions against Hicky. At first, Hicky is actually found not guilty in the very first trial. So it's a great surprise. No one really expected it. The jury debated for perhaps up to 24 hours, and the next day, and it was really a victory for Hicky and those who supported freedom of the press. Unfortunately, Hicky had 3 more trials to go through over the succeeding days, and in each one he was found guilty of libel. What happens then is that the judges have to get together and they have to decide, he's found guilty, what is going to be his sentencing, what's going to be Hicky's punishment. And the judges basically tell Hicky, they say, look, if you stop printing articles that are incendiary or, that we think would cause issues with, the loyalty of our subjects, then we will consider a lighter penalty, a lighter fine. Of course, Hicky doesn't do that at all. He just keeps writing what he does normally. And the judges come back from vacation. They say, okay, we're going to sentence you to a few years in jail, a really heavy fine. And then they put Hicky in jail. And Hicky continues writing a newspaper. He does it from inside a jail cell. He must have had assistants to help him do it. He has a whole staff, right? And that's a criminal case, right? So what Hastings does next is he sues Hicky in civil court. In civil court, there's a lower standard of burden of proof. So in civil court, once Hicky's already in jail, then you just keep adding on fines and fines and fines. You got to keep in mind that you can't leave jail until you pay your fine. So you just add on basically an infinite number of fine, and then you put the person in jail for as long as you want. So that's his Hastings strategy, which is first to sue Hicky in criminal court, get jail time, and then after getting jail time, keep adding fines so Hicky is put in jail and eventually seize his printing press. And that's exactly what Hastings does. And that's how Hicky's newspaper gets shuttered in the end.
Hicky's trial was over and he was now sitting in jail awaiting sentencing. It came on 29th October 1781. He would have to stay in jail for 12 months and pay 2,500 rupees in fines. If he could not pay the fines, he would just have to stay in jail for some more time. 4 days later, he was dragged to court again to be told that Warren Hastings was now suing him in the civil court for the one charge of libel he had already beaten, the charge for printing that Hastings was Clive's miserable successor. There is a reason why Hastings revived this specific prosecution in civil court. You see, Hicky had continued to print his newspaper from prison. This meant he had help, but it was also what Hicky was printing that irked Hastings. In October, a week before his sentencing, Hicky had taken on the looming reputation of none other than Robert Clive, a man who many in the East India Company credited with handing them control of Bengal. He had printed an article which recorded how Clive had forged a document promising a great sum of money to secure the support of a businessman named Amin Chand to unseat Siraj-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Bengal at the time. In fact, there were 2 copies of the document, with one copy bearing a lesser amount that Clive actually intended to pay Amin Chand. Hicky then drew attention to another case, that of Nand Kumar, a tax collector who had accused Hastings of taking bribes from local rulers in 1773. This accusation even caught the attention of Hastings' old rival, Philip Francis. After Hastings had denied the charges, he accused Nand Kumar of forgery and had him executed. The person who had presided over Nand Kumar's case was none other than Warren Hastings' friend Elijah Impey. Hicky, writing from prison in 1781, contrasted the case of Robert Clive to that of Nand Kumar. He pointed out the hypocrisy of the English regime, saying that while Robert Clive was glorified for his forgery, a simple man from India who knew absolutely nothing about English laws was hanged. He even wrote, "Clive was made a peer in England, though he had committed in Bengal the same crime for which we hanged Nand Kumar." Later, he also printed a letter that talked about how Warren Hastings had violated the company's contract with Raja Chait Singh of Banaras. The contract had promised the Raja's independence from the company's control, but Hastings had increased the tribute that Raja Chait Singh had to pay to the company. When Banaras had rebelled in the summer of 1781, Hastings had arrested Chait Singh and brutally crushed the rebellion. Many who wrote to Hicky had sympathy for the Raja and thought that he had not been treated fairly by Hastings. What Hicky was doing was not merely publishing words on paper. He was doing something that struck right at the core of the East India Company. He was questioning their legitimacy and their right to rule India. In early 1782, Hicky also published a letter which hinted that Hastings' men were drunk and delinquent when they were holed up in Chunar Fort after Hastings had escaped the initial outbreak of rebellion in Banaras the previous year. Hastings was infuriated with Hicky's consistent reporting against him and the company. He vowed to shut Hicky and his paper down once and for all. Hence the revival of the prosecution against him in the civil court. This trial began on 12th January 1782. Hicky tried to delay the trial but failed. He then defended himself, saying that calling Hastings Clive's miserable successor was not libel. It was the truth.
I mean, he was dedicated, I'll give him that. Whenever he's quite a troublemaker, I could totally see him just, getting up in the middle of the court and not listening to what anybody else is saying.
He gave his own lawyer such a hard time.
Yeah, well, I think there's some really interesting point with the lawyer, and so Hicky is in his trial, right? And his lawyer is going this one legal tact, and the lawyer basically is trying to say, like, you didn't mean the people that you meant when you talked about them, right? And Hicky says, no, I absolutely meant to refer to Warren Hastings and this and that. And he fires his lawyer in the middle of the trial, and then he says, what really matters is not who I referred to in my newspaper, but what was my intent when I was doing this? Was my intent malicious? And if it was malicious, find me guilty, fine. But if my intent was not malicious, if I printed the truth, if I had the right motivation in doing this, then I should be found innocent. And it was actually really important, and I don't talk about this enough in my book, was that there's this big legal debate in 18th century British Empire. And judges were often saying that the intent, jury, don't mind the intent. That's the judge's responsibility. But printers were saying intent is critical to finding guilt in libel and defamation trials. So this big fight between who decides intent. Is it the jury or the judge? And that debate actually ends about 10 years later. In the US, there's the First Amendment, freedom of the press, which allows intent to be decided by juries effectively. And in the UK, there's Fox's Libel Act. So Hicky's really saying when he says, I'm going to fire my lawyer, I don't want you to stop representing me, is that I don't agree with the law as it's written. I actually think that the jury, you need to decide whether I had malicious intent. This is not the judges. We all know the judges are corrupt. That's not for you to decide. That's not their decision. I want you to decide instead. And that pisses off the Chief Justice a lot. And so there's this really important things that really decide, even to today, what is libel, what is defamation, who decides what malice is. And I think that's something that's really critical to Hicky's trials.
Hicky lost the case. Predictably, Elijah Impey told him that he had libeled an important person and he would have to pay Hastings 5,000 rupees in damages. Hicky still printed a playbill mocking various company servants and Warren Hastings. So Hastings brought 4 more legal cases against him. All of these court proceedings ultimately cost Hicky everything he had. He had to file for bankruptcy. He was, however, allowed to keep his printing press and types. He again wrote something satirical that vaguely mocked Hastings. So Hastings brought 2 more prosecutions against him. On March 23, 1782, after serving 9 months in jail, the ever-persistent Hicky printed a plea to the public about his hardship and promised to never stop printing, come what may. A week later, Elijah Impey had Hicky's printing press and types seized. Everything Hicky owned was auctioned. He was penniless, destitute, and in prison. the whole court case is an example of how the procedure was being followed at the time. So how do you see the kind of procedural framework at the time and how it was being implemented in India? I mean, in England, there were a set of rules, but in the colonies, the same rules were being referred to or were being paid homage to, but they were not being followed in spirit. How do you see the newspaper functioning at that time in that kind of framework where rules were being played with fast and loose?
I think that's a really great question. And you could talk hours and hours about case law from the 18th century, right? But basically what happens is that in 1773, the British Parliament, they institute what's called the Regulating Act, and that's designed to separate the functions of the East India Company between the Supreme Council, which is led by Governor General Warren Hastings. It's a 5-man council, so you need 3 out of the 5 to make any ruling. So it's a voting system. And then there's the Supreme Court, which is originally 4 judges, but one dies, so it turns out to be 3 judges. And the court is designed to be a check on the Supreme Council. Well, what happens is that a lot of the British who are in the Supreme Council, they end up dying. So 2 of the 5 members die. One leaves India, another one comes, and then Warren Hastings has a duel with his opponent, a man named Philip Francis. He wounds Philip Francis. Francis returns to England, and now there's only 2 men on the council, and the other man is loyal to Warren Hastings. So Hastings doesn't have to worry about having to, vote to get his way on the council. He is the council. At the same time, there's the Supreme Court, and there's a lot of issues between the court and the council, and a lot of who has the right to issue habeas corpus, to protect people outside in Bengal, to all these fundamental rights, and basically at one point there's this really important showdown between the Supreme Council and Supreme Court. I don't really talk about this in my book, but the court goes to seize someone so they can take them and bring them to trial. And the Supreme Council actually takes the Supreme Court's sheriff, seizes the sheriff himself, and says, you can't take this man because we have the right to decide whether he pays taxes to us. And so the Supreme Court is left in this position where it can't really do anything. And this leads some of the members of the court to try to find accommodation with the Supreme Council. So what happens is Warren Hastings effectively bribes the Chief Justice, a man named Elijah Impey, and then bribes the second justice, a man named Robert Chambers, which leaves only one judge who hasn't been affected by Warren Hastings. That's a man named John Hyde. So there's 2 of the 3 judges on the Supreme Court who have been, and it's debatable, but in my opinion, who have been bought by Warren Hastings. So you really don't have an independent judiciary anymore. So that's one thing that's going on. The other thing is that, just like in the 13 colonies in the United States now, one of the fundamental points for rebellion against the British was that there was no representation for taxation, right? The people have to have a say. And in India, in British India, there's no representation as well. And so one of Hickey's main points is that if you're going to tax us, then we need some type of say in government. And we don't have that say. And not only do we not have that say, we don't actually even have an independent judiciary to protect our rights. So these 2 things, they really play into Hickey's trials. And when Hickey tries to defend himself, he accuses Elijah Impey of corruption in the trial itself. That doesn't help him at all because Elijah Impey is the same man who's going to be overseeing his sentencing. So, what good does that do? But Hickey's really trying to appeal to the public, appeal to people back in England and say, look, there's corruption going on here. I don't have a fair shake, and I don't really have a way to appeal. There's nothing I can do. And the only way to do that is to get enough public outrage to make a difference. And I think that's a strategy. Ultimately, it fails for him. But I think that's also something that really caused a lot of Warren Hastings and the East India Company see a lot of danger in Hickey because he's advocating for the same things that caused a revolution in the United States and in 13 colonies. And British, the last thing they want to do is lose another set of colonies, right? If they lose the United States, they lose the 13 colonies. What happens if they lose British India? And that's not even something they could consider. That's beyond the pale. So anything they can do to shut Hicky down, they'll do it.
With his press and type seized, Hicky had no way of making money to pay off his fines. The judges refused to forgive them. Why would they? After all, he had accused the judges of being bought by Hastings. For all the fanfare of the Bengal Gazette, only a few of Hicky's supporters came out in support of him when he needed money to pay his fines. For instance, one of the items for which Hicky stood trial was authored by someone under the pseudonym Bystander. This was the article that had referred to Warren Hastings as Clive's miserable successor. Bystander was in reality a man called William Young. Remarkably, Hicky had never revealed the identity of the man who had written the libelous article during his trials. Had he done so, William Young would have faced the libel charge instead of Hicky. Young and many other people who had corresponded with Hicky never had the courage to come forward and support him openly. Later, when Hicky wrote to Young seeking some financial help and reminded him of what trauma he had undergone to protect his identity, Young threw him under the bus. He did not take the bait or feel particularly guilty. Instead, William Young sent Hicky's letter to his rival newspaper, who then turned it into a sensational story. Young also denied ever having written for the Bengal Gazette. By 1784, even Warren Hastings knew his days in India were numbered. He was recalled to England after British MP Edmund Burke's report into the injustices of the East India Company in Bengal and the personal corruption of Hastings had struck a huge blow to his career and reputation. He began winding up his affairs in India. One of the last things Warren Hastings did was forgive Hicky's fines, as Hicky had already spent over 2 years in jail. Hastings left India in 1785. In 1786, Edmund Burke led the impeachment proceedings against Warren Hastings in the British House of Commons and in 1788 in the House of Lords. The impeachment proceedings dragged until 1795, when Hastings was acquitted. But he had secured his place in the brutal history of the British Empire. Back in Calcutta during this time, Hicky was a broken man. He had tried to restart his newspaper in 1786, but it failed. Penniless, abandoned, and isolated, he kept writing to company officials to reimburse him for the old printing jobs that he had been commissioned for before he had started his newspaper. But instead of 43,514 rupees, which he was owed, he got offered a sum of only 6,711 rupees. Hicky again wrote to the company to ask how they had arrived at this amount. The company replied that they did not owe him any explanation. So desperate was Hicky that by 1799 he wrote to Warren Hastings in a moving letter, "Sir, it would be painful to you to read a long and particular account of the distress of myself and my children. Let it suffice that everything which I had has been sold and mortgaged for my unhappy family, and none but God and ourselves know the keenness of our distress." James Augustus Hicky, December 26, 1799. For all his eccentricities and recklessness, Hicky never lost sight of the bigger questions about journalism, press, and legality throughout his career as a journalist. He evolved his ethics and principles of journalism through practice. But at what cost?
In May 1802, Hicky, who now looked older than his years, stepped aboard a ship called the Ajax. The Ajax was on its way to Canton to bring back a cargo of hemp and nutmeg. Hicky had boarded this ship in desperation wrought from poverty. The fortune he had hoped to make in India had never been made, and his legal problems, combined with his time in jail, had left him in a state of penury. So abject were his conditions that he had contemplated sending his children back to London to be placed in charity homes. Hicky had contracted a cough. It is unknown if he was already ill when he boarded the ship or if he became ill on board. Every time he coughed, his body shook with the effort and his handwriting became unsteady. Then one day, he collapsed completely. He was found by crew members on the ship, and they carefully began the process of wrapping him in his hammock and sewing the hammock like a shroud, starting at his feet and working their way to the top of Hicky's body. Back then, the last stitch was put through the nose of the deceased person to verify that they were indeed deceased. Hicky's body was then taken to the deck of the Ajax, where a mess table awaited his still form. He was placed on it. Cannonballs were tied to the feet of his cocooned body. Then the captain of the Ajax performed the last rites. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. At a nod from the captain, the ship's crew tipped the table over the taffrail of the Ajax, and James Augustus Hicky slipped into another world where he would never know hardship and struggle again. Over the next 2 centuries, Hicky's newspaper would be seen as little more than a tabloid rag run by a man who was considered mostly uneducated, ill-mannered, and hot-tempered. Many of these accounts were written by people who still believed in the glory of the British Empire. Other accounts tended to abridge their commentary and assessments of Hicky, beginning and ending with the fact that he had started the first newspaper in India and was considered annoying by Warren Hastings. The rediscovery of the depth of Hicky's contributions to Indian journalism is a recent phenomenon.
When you are describing the perspectives or experiences of each of the characters, there is this empathy with each of them which comes across. So was it something that was intentional, or was it because of the nature of the sources that you were dealing with, because they were mostly based on correspondences of the characters themselves?
I tried to get in it to everyone's head. I think the fundamental idea behind the book was sort of to realize that, even Hickey's the protagonist, right? Hastings is the main antagonist in the book. But nonetheless, they're all human, right? They all have goals and aspirations and things they want to achieve in their life. And I really tried to bring that to the fore and to show that, none of these people are as good as you might think or as evil as you might think, right? They're all human still. And I think that's what's most important. I had this conversation with one of the descendants of Kieran-Ender. Became friends. I met him in London, and he had done all this family biographic research of his ancestor, and I thought to myself, Kieran-Ender, this missionary who embezzles from his own church, stereotypical antagonist in a story, right? But he's still human. He still has very many positive qualities about himself, and talking with his descendant, I sort of realized that, look, I need to take every person in this book and try to treat them as fairly as I can.
Did Hickey's newspaper catalyze the nascent newspaper industry in India in the late 1700s? We asked Andrew about this.
You think about who's actually running the newspaper, right? Hickey's in charge, but is he doing the day-to-day printing? No, very unlikely. He's got a number of assistants who are most likely a mix of lower-class Europeans and Anglo-Indians, and maybe some Bengalis, some other Indians. And then what's happening is that these individuals who Hickey's trained, and I mentioned this in my book to some extent, they are training Indians, and then they are training Indians, right? And so you make it like a family tree. It progressively goes down. So within the newspaper industry itself, right, there has to be knowledge transfer, and that starts from Hicky, and that starts from some other printers. And then in terms of the topics that are covered in India's first newspaper, you can see very much sort of a European focus on the topics. And I think that if you were to, I think that Hicky's Bengal Gazette had lasted for more than just 2 years. You probably would see a lot more Indians showing up in the documentation. And one of the reasons I say that is that, I forget, the Calcutta Gazette, there's a newspaper like 5 years later, which is printed in both English and I think Hindi. I can't remember if it's Urdu or Bangla as well. But anyways, it's printed in vernacular and in English. Yeah. And that's the official government newspaper. So, there is a lot of interest for newspapers among Indians in Calcutta, and I think that spans beyond specific language, beyond specific culture, whether you're Persian or Bengali or general North Indian, and so you see it progresses on, and about 40 years later you have the Bengal Gazette in 1818, which is the first Indian-run, Indian-owned Bengali language newspaper. And things really progressed from there.
Hicky's newspaper indeed got the ball rolling on the newspaper business in India. It became so popular in the country that a lot of new newspapers cropped up in the next few years. Before Hicky's Gazette, the European community in Bengal was getting its news only from the imported European editions that did not feature any news from Bengal. Hicky managed to create a market for an Indian newspaper where none existed. A newspaper that talked about the immediate concerns of the Europeans in Bengal and to some extent that of Indians as well. In doing so, he also created a sense of community in the civil and military officials of the East India Company. Their shared concerns about corruption, abuse of power, and mismanagement of the military were featured in Hicky's newspaper. That's the funny thing about the newspaper. Since its inception, it has brought people together and made them belong to a community. Author of the book Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson, whom we have already referred to, wrote that the newspaper created an extraordinary mass ceremony of an almost precisely simultaneous consumption of the news. Imagine, for centuries, you, me, our relatives, friends, neighbors, and even those whom we do not know, no matter how far away we are, have been turning the fresh, crisp pages of the newspaper early in the morning, sipping our hot cups of tea or coffee, almost at the same time. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of the most influential philosophers in the world, even observed that reading the morning newspaper is the realist's morning prayer. This is how, as Anderson said, newspapers came to serve modern man as a substitute for morning prayers. Anderson points out that though this mass ceremony is performed in the silent privacy in the lair of the skull, yet each reader is well aware that this ceremony is being replicated simultaneously by many others. He says that this is how newspapers help in the imagination of communities. And while Anderson is talking about the imagination of a much larger community, that is, a nation, the one that comprised European readers in Bengal during the late 18th century was a much smaller one, but also that much easier to imagine. Newspapers like that of Hicky had provided them a foundation to imagine themselves not as a nation, but a public nonetheless. And soon, a newspaper would emerge which would give space for this public to imagine itself as a republic of letters. That and more next on Reality Scribes.
We would like to thank Dr. Andrew Otis for his valuable time and insights that helped us script this episode. Reality Scribes has been conceptualized, scripted, narrated, and produced by Sumit Chaturvedi and me, Vasundhara Sirnate. All source material used in this episode can be found in the show notes. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own and do not always reflect the opinions of Reality Scribes or the podcast hosts. You can listen to Reality Scribes on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, share, and comment, and do subscribe to our channel. Also, click the bell icon for notifications for when we drop a new episode. You can follow us on social media at Reality Scribes on X, Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon. You can also email us your questions and comments at realityscribes@gmail.com for a chance to be featured on our podcast. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, friends.